Welcome, everyone. We're so happy to have you with us this morning for a virtual meeting with one of our scientists. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. My name is Jessica, and I work with the education team at the Natural History Museum. Today, we're meeting with a special guest from our Research and Collections Department. The Natural History Museum is home to 35 million objects and specimens. Our scientists use these collections to conduct research on people and nature, past and present. Each scientist has a special area of focus for their research, but together they are helping to build the history of life on our planet. In just a moment, we're going to hear from Dr. Kayce Bell, Assistant Curator of Mammalogy at the Natural History Museum. Mammalogy is the study of mammals, and Dr. Bell specifically focuses on our terrestrial or land-based mammals. Museum collections form a vital component of Kayce's research on mammal and parasite diversity and distribution. She's interested in the processes that lead to new species and how diversity of host mammals impacts the evolution of their parasites. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can meet our presenter today, and you'll see me again in a little bit. Hi, Dr. Bell.
Hi, thank you for the introduction. I'll go ahead and get started with my slides. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and the research that I've done, and then some about the museum as well and the collections that I am in charge of. So I work with wild animals to understand how species evolve and how host-parasite relationships evolve. Another way to think of that is I'm really interested in understanding how the diversity of species that we see today arose. So how did we get to all of the chipmunks that we have, and how have their parasites evolved alongside them? One of the things I do is I use museum specimens to study all of these animals and try to understand where they live, how their distributions might change under different circumstances, or how they may have changed in the past, and also trying to understand different parasite communities. So what different species of parasites are there on different species of animals at different points in time or at different places in the world. In order to do that, I have been very fortunate to get to do a lot of field work. So my research and then also just working in museums has taken me around the world. Most of my work has been in Western North America, in the United States, the lower 48, as well as Canada, and then into Alaska. But I've also been able to do field work in Panama, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and Mongolia. And so this has been a really great way to get to see the world and also get to see some really neat animals as I go. So I'm going to introduce you a little bit to my research and kind of the basic understanding of how we study species evolution. So take these pretend population of chipmunks here. You can see they're all black. So this is our chipmunks that are black, and they live in this valley between a green mountain and an orange mountain. Let's say it gets hot, temperatures warm up. This has happened several times in the past. We know the climate has cycled and gotten warmer and cooler. And when the temperatures got warm, the chipmunks didn't like it. The species couldn't survive in the valley where it was really hot. So they went up in elevation and they went up these two mountains where it was cooler. And perhaps over time, they were isolated from one another and they may have evolved into two new species. And then they can come back down in the valley, but instead of having one species of chipmunk in the valley, we now have these two new species, which are each descended from that one population. And then they can intermingle, and I'll talk a little bit more about what happens when they intermingle later. So when these changes happen, they leave a signal in the DNA. So you know that we have DNA in our cells, and when animals reproduce, or plants reproduce, or bacteria, they send a signature of their DNA to their offspring. Over many generations, this leaves these signals that we can see that can tell us about the past. So I use that DNA information to understand how species are related and what processes lead to new species, such as that example I just gave you. Now, the way that we study this is by using evolutionary or phylogenetic trees. So if you imagine that ancestral population of chipmunks in the black, It went up on those mountains and diverged into these two new species, the orange and the green species. And then just kind of use your imagination that process could happen over and over again across the landscape. And we could go from having this one species of chipmunk that was found all over. Now these processes have led to this new diversity, and we now have 5 new species of chipmunks. And the way that we represent that when we're doing these studies is with a phylogenetic or evolutionary trait. So this is the way that we understand how different species are related and trace back in time how they have evolved. So I've been doing this kind of work for a long time. When I was an undergraduate student at Idaho State University, I got a bachelor's degree in biology, and I started by actually doing lab work on redback voles, which lived in Alaska and Canada, and trying to understand how the species came to be where they are found today. During that time, I also got to do a lot of field work surveying the small mammal species that are found in the national parks in Alaska. So this was part of my undergraduate work. Got paid to go do this field work. Then I stayed at Idaho State University to do my master's degree. For my master's degree, I actually studied ground squirrels in California. So I studied the Mohave and round-tailed ground squirrels. And for this project, I was studying, my first question was, are these two species actually distinct species, or should they actually be considered one single species? And then I was also interested in gene flow and what characteristics of the landscape, so things like roads or other features that may impact movement among populations in Mohave ground squirrels. Mohave ground squirrels are listed as threatened in the state of California. So this work was actually trying to see if we could discover things that might inhibit or allow gene flow among the different ground squirrel populations. We did find that they are indeed two distinct species with very little evidence of gene flow or hybridization between the two species. And we were able to identify some of the roads as major barriers to gene flow in Mohave ground squirrel populations. After my master's degree, I was a research assistant at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and that is where I discovered my love of chipmunks. So the research that I participated in there was studying the diversity of chipmunks and trying to understand how these 23 species of chipmunks that we have in Western North America have come to be. I got so inspired by that project that I decided I wanted to go back to school and get a PhD. And I did that studying the diversity of the parasites and the evolution of the parasites in chipmunks. So this map here is just to show you that there's 23 species of chipmunks in Western North America, and they are found all over in Western North America. And each of those colored outlines represents the distribution of the different species. So you can see there's a lot of places where multiple species come into contact, and I'm interested in where they share parasites and if there are things that we can see that may identify when chipmunks can or cannot share parasites. During that time, both my time at the Denver Museum as well as when I was a graduate student, I got to do a lot of field work, traveling around looking for chipmunks in all these really cool places. I'm just going to share with you one of the cool things that we've found in this research is that what is currently considered the yellow pine chipmunk, or Tamias aminus, is actually two species. So you can see on the top here is one or two specimens of the yellow pine chipmunk. And then on the bottom are two specimens of this new species. It's currently called the Curator's chipmunk, or Tamias aminus cratericus. So it's currently considered a subspecies of the yellow pine chipmunk. But in reality, when we look at their genital bones, they're actually quite different from one another. It may not seem that different if you haven't seen a lot of chipmunk genital bones, but the male genital bones of chipmunks are actually quite distinct from one another. And that, along with genetic evidence, has suggested that the Curator's chipmunk is a distinct species and should be called Tamias cratericus instead of Tamias aminus cratericus. So in addition to the chipmunk work, I also have done a lot of work on the parasites. So I'm interested in these organisms that live in or on another organism, which is called the host, and then how these parasites may be evolving alongside and what some of the costs might be to the parasites. So I've already talked about the chipmunks. If you can just imagine with me for a moment how these parasites evolve. So the black chipmunks had a black louse, and then it diversified into the orange and green chipmunks. There are a few different possible scenarios. One is the lice might not change at all. They may actually just stay the same species. And this one species of louse, the black species, is capable of parasitizing all three species of chipmunks. However, the lice could also potentially diverge on their own too, and they could be specialized. So now each species of chipmunk has its own distinct species of louse. There's also these other scenarios where we could get host switches. So for example, in California, where there's a lot of introduced species of, and some of them are tree squirrels, some of the questions I'm interested in is when we have new species arriving on the landscape, are they able to share parasites? And so in this potential example, there could be a purple louse from a squirrel that's able to infest a green chipmunk. So I study sucking lice, and these lice are similar to the lice that humans have. So if you have or have heard of anybody, know anybody that has had lice, they are related to these guys, but these ones are only found on chipmunks. And so they can't get on humans. I also study some of the parasites that live on the inside. So these are nematodes or roundworms, and these are called pinworms, and they live in the lower part of the gastrointestinal tract. And what I'm really interested in is how these different species of parasites are evolving alongside their hosts. And the reason that this is important is because I'm very interested in the processes that allow parasites to move to new hosts. And what I've found is that different species of parasites have evolved, and there are different species of parasites that we find on different species of chipmunks vary by the host species. So it depends on what species of chipmunks are present. Sometimes multiple species of chipmunks in one area share parasites, and sometimes they don't. And I've also found that climate has shaped which parasites can live where. So it does seem that if it's really dry, pinworms aren't able to survive. And so it's likely that chipmunks that live in really arid areas, they could potentially not have these pinworms. And if you imagine that that's happened in the past, we could have species that have, or populations of chipmunks that have entirely lost this endoparasite. So overall, what I found is that activities or events that change host species distributions or that change where chipmunks live is also going to impact the parasites that can live with those chipmunks. Now I'll just close with a few minutes talking about the collections at the museum, the mammal collections. So I am the curator of the terrestrial mammals, so that is the mammals that live on land. But overall, in the mammalogy collections, we have about 1,700 species of mammals represented, and that's about a third of all the species of species of mammals that are known. We have about 99,000 specimens of mammals. Most of those are the terrestrial ones, so those are the ones that I am responsible for. And as a curator, I'm responsible for ensuring basically the care and long-term condition security of the collections. So I want to make sure that these collections are going to be available for researchers far into the future when they have questions about species diversity, and they may say, I want to know in 1930 what species of chipmunks were found outside of Big Bear or something like that. They can come to our collections and say what species of chipmunks were found in this area. So my job is to make sure that these specimens and their data are going to remain available into the future. We have fluid preserved specimens, which are these jars up on the right. So those are actually jars of bats that are preserved in alcohol. And then we have a lot of study skin specimens. So most of our specimens are these study skins, which are the things that you can see on the bottom. There's a dormouse, a flying fox, and then some kangaroos, tree kangaroos. And then this skull right, most of the skins are accompanied by skeletal material. So this is a skull from a platypus. We have about 44,000 specimens from California. So most of our specimens are actually from the Western North America, particularly California. But we have samples from about 115 countries. Some of our particular collections of interest are the Channel Islands. We have specimens that have been collected on the Channel Islands dating back to the 20s when there were the biological surveys were conducted out there. So some different bats and unique subspecies of mice, as well as the island foxes. And then way back in the day, when museum expeditions went to Africa and places like that to collect specimens for the dioramas, they didn't just collect things like rhinoceroses. They also collected their parasites. So these are the parasites from those rhinoceroses that are actually kept in our entomology collection. Those are a type of botfly. But they also collected a bunch of other types of mammals. So here we have another species of flying fox, or a fruit bat. We have a spring hare, a scaly-tailed squirrel, some cool ground squirrels, a hyrax, whose closest relative is actually the elephant, And then we have pangolins. So there's a lot of really neat diversity that we have in our collections besides just the things that are found locally. And with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you so much, Kayce. So interesting. We have a couple of questions from some students. Let's start with Rebecca. Rebecca is wondering, how many types of chipmunks or squirrels have you discovered or studied?
So there's 25 species of chipmunks around the world. There's one that's found in Asia and into Europe. That's the Eurasian chipmunk. Then there's the chipmunk that's found in Eastern North America called the Eastern chipmunk. Then there's the 23 species in Western North America. So I have worked with all 25 of those. When I was in Mongolia, I got to see the Eurasian chipmunks as well. And then the 23 species in Western North America are actually, that's not quite right. So we know that there's 2 new species that haven't been described. One of them is that Curator's chipmunk I mentioned, and there's another one. We also know that one chipmunk that's currently called the Palmer's chipmunk actually isn't a distinct species. It's really just a population of the Uinta chipmunk. So I've seen all the 25 recognized species of chipmunks, and there's a few more species to add to that list.
Interesting. To piggyback on that, how would you describe the difference between a chipmunk and a squirrel?
That's a great question. I love that question. Chipmunks are actually a type of squirrel. So the family Sciuridae is all squirrels, and there's about 260 species of what we call squirrels, but that includes everything from chipmunks to marmots to tree squirrels to ground squirrels and prairie dogs. All of those are actually technically considered squirrels.
Neat.
But the best way to identify a chipmunk, if you want to know for sure if you're looking at a chipmunk or a ground squirrel, is they have stripes on their face. Chipmunks are the only squirrels in North America that have stripes on their face.
Cute. Kelly is wondering, why do parasites go on other organisms?
Because they're just trying to survive. So parasites just live where they can make a living. I mean, they really are just trying to survive and reproduce. And so they're going to be found anywhere that they can do that. And what's interesting about parasites is most of the time they're called host specific, which means they can really only live on or in one species. But occasionally they do find themselves on a new species of host that they are capable of parasitizing. And so if that happens, they're probably going to exploit that, do as best as they can to survive and reproduce there.
Interesting. Thank you. So more about parasites. Brooke is wondering, how do you remove parasites from an animal?
So I work in the museum, and one of the things that we do at the museum is we euthanize these specimens and bring them back into the collections. So when we collect a specimen, we collect all sorts of data from it. We take all of the measurements, we save the skull and the skin, and we go through the GI tracts to look for parasites. We save tissues to look for diseases and also for DNA work. And so the first thing I do is I actually take the specimen and I put it under a dissecting scope, and I just comb through the fur with some tweezers trying to find little parasites, and then I just pull them off and put them in ethanol. And then for looking on the inside, I take the GI tract out and I actually cut open the intestines and rinse it out with water. And then I just look through it and take out all the parasites I find.
Wow, delicate work. Thank you. Irene is wondering, what inspired you to research terrestrial mammals?
There's sometimes for some real honesty. I actually started out wanting to study marine mammals. I grew up thinking whales and dolphins were just neat. They are, don't get me wrong. But when I got to college, I realized that was actually kind of limiting, because while there are a lot of really neat things that live in the ocean, it's kind of difficult to study them. And there's a lot of people who are studying whales and dolphins. And I decided that it would be much more fun to study things that I could see a lot more often. And that was how I decided to study terrestrial mammals. So things that I could see a lot easier.
Cool, makes sense. Tavisha is wondering, how long did you spend in college to do this amazing job?
Thanks. I did my bachelor's degree in 4.5 years. I did my master's degree in 2.5 years. And then I did my PhD in 6 years. So it adds up to I should be able to do that math in my head quickly, 13 years total for college. Some of that was aided by my time working at the Denver Museum. That actually gave me a little bit of a boost during my PhD. But I also spent a lot of time during my PhD doing field work that had nothing to do with my research. So if I wouldn't have done that, I probably could have finished my PhD sooner.
Was there any break in that time from
No,
academia?
so my time when I was working at the Denver Museum was technically doing academic work as a research assistant, but I wasn't really in college. And then I actually also took a year between my master's degree and working at the Denver Museum where I did high school outreach, which was
Cool.
a fun job too.
Yeah, cool. Aiden is wondering, how do you determine if something is a parasite?
Ooh, that's a topic of hot debate among some people. The technical definition of a parasite is something that requires a host to garner resources and it hurts the host. So the degree of hurt or the degree of cost to the host is really variable. Some costs just means that like it takes up some space in your intestine, but it doesn't really actually hurt you very much. It's still costing the host something. But technically a parasite is anything that requires another organism to survive at the expense of the other organism.
Interesting. Patrick is wondering, how long would it take for a species to become a few different species of an animal?
That's another great question. It's variable. It's really, I mean, it depends on the processes and what different things are happening. Some of the fastest examples are probably on the order of I think, I shouldn't be throwing numbers out there. I will just say somewhere around, usually it's between about 200,000 to many millions of years. It just really depends on the processes and what's going on. But if species are separated and isolated from one another and there's no gene flow between them and it requires, or they are evolve new adaptations to survive on the landscape, there's other processes that can happen too, something called genetic drift. Those can actually lead to fairly rapid evolution. And although like 500,000 years doesn't sound fast to us, it's really fast in the big scheme of things.
Yeah. So Charlotte is wondering about the collections. She's wondering, how do you keep all the mammals there? Do they need to be a certain temperature or in certain places?
Yes, they do. So all of our collections are stored in the cabinets. The dry collections are stored in cabinets. And we try to keep a low humidity, but a consistent humidity. And we try to keep it relatively cool. So we usually try to keep the temperatures in the mid to upper 60s. And then, yeah, we just keep an eye on them. One of the big concerns in collections is pests. So we actually have to do a lot of work to make sure that there aren't things like beetles that get into the collections and eat them. That causes a lot of problems.
Interesting. So Aziza is wondering, how do parasites travel from one host to another?
It depends on the type of parasite. So I'm going to just keep using lice and pinworms as my examples because they're the easiest ones for me. But so for lice, if anybody's ever had head lice, they can actually imagine how they might travel from one host to another. It's like, usually it requires coming into contact. So for people, it doesn't necessarily have to be like you have to touch another person, but you might share a hat with another person or lay your head on a pillow as another person. And all that takes is one louse that was hanging out on that pillow or on that hat to move over to another person. Other things like pinworms, they don't actually have to touch each other in any way, shape, or form. They just have to live in the same area because pinworm eggs are shed into the environment. So when a chipmunk defecates, it'll shed pinworm eggs as well. And if those eggs happen to land on a seed, then another chipmunk's going to come along and eat that seed, and then it's going to ingest the pinworm like that. So it just depends on the type of parasite.
Great evolution. So Manuel, kind of along the same lines, is wondering, can parasites from land mammals spread to ocean mammals?
That's a great question. I don't know. There are no species of like lice. Actually, no, they can go back and forth because there are species of tapeworms that are found in fish that bears can get and humans can get them too if they eat raw fish. So there are definitely parasites that can move back and forth between land and ocean animals.
Good to know. So Brooke, continuing down this path, is wondering, can chipmunks give humans parasites?
No, the humans and chipmunks are sufficiently different from one another that we can't them. I guess potentially you could probably get bitten by a flea or a tick. that is on a chipmunk because those tend to be more generalists. But I don't think there'd be anything that would become a long-term permanent host on a person from interacting with chipmunks.
Okay, here's some fun ones from a couple students asked this. Justin and Roman are wondering, what is your favorite chipmunk?
My favorite chipmunk is probably the least chipmunk because it is just found everywhere. It's a super cool, versatile little chipmunk. Sometimes they're gray and sometimes they're really brightly colored, and they can live in low elevation deserts all the way up to the very tops of mountains. So they're just really fun, cute little squirrels or chipmunks that can be found everywhere.
Cute. We've got a few more minutes for questions. So Karthikeyan, sorry if I didn't say your name right, Karthikeyan is wondering, are there more factors than climate that can affect how often parasites undergo a host switch?
I feel like you've been reading some scientific literature to ask that question. Yes, the answer is yes. And we don't honestly have a good handle on all of the factors, but there's a lot of things like the population size of the hosts can impact things like that. So really large populations may be less likely to share their parasites with other species because the species are doing really well in the host. But there could be instances where there's just small populations of hosts that come into contact with another one, then they're able to change. Man, I just don't have the time. There are a lot of really cool processes we don't fully understand, actually.
Cool. And we'll do one more question, maybe one more. Brooke is wondering, what would happen if evolution wasn't possible?
Well, evolution is just a really, like, the simplest way to explain evolution is it's just small changes over time. And so if there was no evolution, if things didn't change over time, things would probably just become extinct because the world changes and animals have to be able to respond to that change. If it gets hot, species have to be able to respond in some way or another. So they have to be able to adapt.
Makes sense. Okay, I know that I said one more, but I've got one more. So Caitlin is wondering, are any chipmunk species extinct?
Yes, none have gone extinct recently. So within the last 10,000 years that we know of, I'm not saying they haven't been done, that we know of have gone extinct very recently. But there are the ancestors, there's really old species of chipmunks that were probably the ancestors of some of the species of chipmunks that we have today. But none are extinct or threatened in the same way that we think of things like tigers or panda bears.
Cool. Well, we are about out of time, Dr. Kayce Bell. Thank you so much for joining us today, for answering all of our student questions. Thank you. We learned so much.
Thank you.
And thank you to our friends and our students for joining us this morning. We learned so much about mammals and their parasites. We will have all of the videos from these presentations on our YouTube channel for you to watch later. You can catch this recording and others at youtube.com/NHMLA. Thank you again for joining us. We hope to see you again soon. Bye.